And without further ado, I'll tell you a little bit about our speaker today, Sister Mary McCormick. Sister Mary was elected General Superior of the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown in 2014. Sister Mary ministers as a professor specializing in systematic theology and as an academic dean of St. Mary's Seminary and Graduate School of Theology in Cleveland. She has served on St. Mary's faculty since 1997. She also was an instructor at St. Thomas Aquinas High School in Louisville and Ursuline High School in Youngstown. Previous to being named General Superior, Sister Mary served as Finance Director for the Ursuline Sisters on the leadership team and as Formation and Vocations Director. Sister Mary has a doctorate in systematic theology from Fordham University in the Bronx, New York, a Master of Religious Education from Loyola University in New Orleans, a Master of Arts in Theology from Duquesne University, and a Bachelor's in Education from Youngstown State University. She also holds several professional certifications. An Austintown native, Sister Mary graduated from Ursuline High School and became a nun in 1975. Please welcome Sister Mary McCormick.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thanks to all of you here that are part of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. We're thrilled to have this kind of cooperative venture. We're Youngstowners, talking about the Arms Museum up the street on Wick Avenue. I live on Elm Street, so I'm very close to there. I taught at Ursuline High School for 8 to 10 years. I lived at the convent at Ursuline. I've lived on the north side probably 35 years of my life. My mother's parents were originally from St. Columba. My father's parents were from Immaculate Conception, and then they moved way out to the south side, St. Patrick's and St. Dominic's, that in those days was really moving out from the city. But Youngstown has really been home, so I'm really happy to share a little bit of our history of the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown with all of you. All right? So I always like to put things in a bit of historical context. And so you're thinking to yourself, we'll never get done if I actually start with Jesus, But that's really the place to begin. One, Jesus was a great storyteller. And what he did and his life, his ministry, his teaching, his preaching, his healing, his reaching out to people, especially the lost and the forsaken, literally, that mission and ministry of Jesus changed the world. And so you have the beginning of a new religion in Christianity. But in addition, you have people throughout time then, for the last 2,000 years, who've been willing to commit their lives in gospel service, in religious service, in imitation of what Jesus did. In the beginning, that was a really risky proposition. And the first couple hundred years of the church's history led to some martyrdom, and martyrdom has been part of the Christian tradition from the very beginning. But once the major era of martyrdom got over, and that happened in the early 4th century, you had people begin to say, well, how can I be a really committed follower of Jesus even if it's not really much of an opportunity for martyrdom, not that I want to be a martyr anyways, but, that doesn't even seem to be the cultural mix. What we know today as religious life, and I use religious life in the broadest sense of the term, what we know today as religious life had its kind of founding in those days after religious persecution was over. So in the 4th century, and though it didn't start with St. Benedict, this is kind of a rendering of St. Benedict, though it didn't start exactly with St. Benedict, it was St. Benedict who kind of gave a form and a shape to religious life. Benedict is known as the father of monasticism, a particular form of religious life that has carried through from the 6th century until we get to our own day. There is still a Benedictine monastery of women in Erie, Pennsylvania. There's a Benedictine monastery of men in Cleveland, Ohio. And that kind of religious life has had a very, very long history. And every time Benedictines would move from one city to another, they would start a new house, a new monastery, a new place of their formation. And that's kind of how religious life got started. When we get to the 13th century, so you can see how I'm kind of moving through history pretty quickly here. When we get to the 13th century, we have a major shift in religious life. And that major shift in religious life is characterized by two people that I think are familiar to everybody, whether or not you know much about Catholicism or Christianity. St. Francis and St. Dominic. What Francis and Dominic did in the 13th century was to initiate a new form. Benedict had been the father of monasticism. Francis and Dominic now take up religious life in what's called mendicant religious life. That's not a word that's typically familiar to all of us, but what it means is they wanted to get out into the marketplace. They wanted to get out and be among the people. They took on different gifts of the church, and in fact, that's one of the characteristics of religious life. People take on different gifts of the church, gifts of Jesus, and make them part of the very core of their lives. For St. Francis, he wanted to take on the gift of poverty and highlight that poverty. He wanted to imitate the life of Jesus. In the passage it says, foxes have holes and other animals have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That kind of extreme poverty. And Francis was an itinerant preacher. Dominic was very much a scholar. He wanted to study, and particularly study the scripture. And he wanted to connect that to prayer, but he wanted to do it so that he could be a good preacher. So we have St. Dominic's parish here on the south side of Youngstown. The Dominican fathers have been there, and for a long time the Dominican sisters were there as well. Their life was dedicated to study and prayer so that they could be good teachers and preachers. And that became a new form of religious life in the church. We still have those forms of religious life for both men and women in the church, and they continue to this day. A third change in religious life came in the 16th century. One of the people who gets credit for initiating this new form of religious life is St. Ignatius of Loyola. He's the founder of what we call the Jesuits. So maybe some of you went to John Carroll University, or you've gone to another Jesuit university. There are numerous of them within our country, and the Jesuits have a really strong history of education. But what Ignatius of Loyola was most known for was saying, yes, I want to be a person of prayer. Yes, I want to preach the gospel. Yes, I want to be very much part of imitating the life of Jesus, but I want to do that right in the midst of the people. I don't want to be in a monastery. I don't really want to be a Franciscan or a Dominican. I want to be in and among the people. And so Ignatius starts this new form of religious life that today we call apostolic religious life. And Ignatius did that for men. Less well known, but for me and for us here in the Youngstown area, and anybody who has a connection to Ursulines, is St. Angela Merici. And Angela Merici did the same thing for women. Now, I say she's less well known. One of the reasons I think she's less well known is because one of the hallmarks of Jesuits, and I mean this with all due respect, but they keep writing about themselves and writing about each other and telling their story in very common ways. You know, they created journals and and then they write about themselves in their own journals, and so that story gets very well known. The women didn't usually have as much opportunity to do that, and they tended not to establish journals in the same way. So Angela Merici is less well known, but I think just as significant. In fact, the founding of the Ursuline Sisters predates the founding of the Jesuits by a few years. But one of the interesting things about history and about the kind of evolution of religious life is very many places in the world, wherever you do have Ursulines, you also have Jesuits. It's not true here in Youngstown, but it is true many places in the world, and they're often very closely connected. One of the places I studied was Fordham University in the Bronx, and just over the Parkway in the Bronx is the Ursuline Academy. So right there is an example of having Ursulines and Jesuits very close together. But I really want to tell the story of St. Angela because that's so significant to how we understand who we are. Angela was a woman who lived in the days of the Reformation. Now, there are lots of things we could say about the Reformation. I want to just lift up a couple of things. One is, we know the church needed reform. And the church even knew it needed reform. It wasn't always willing to do that real quickly, but it knew it needed reform. Secondly, it was an era in which literacy was a huge issue. Who could read, in what language a person could read, and what they would read. All of those were part of the Reformation era. St. Angela, even though probably few people really could read, one book that I read estimated that at the time of the Reformation in Germany, maybe 3 to 4% of the population could read. It's kind of astounding when I read that. 3 to 4% of the population could read. It's a really small number. And if you ask yourself the question, who were those people? They were probably wealthy. They were probably priests. They were probably people, member of the nobility. They were the people who could really have the access to learn how to read. One of the things that St. Angela presumed of the women that she gathered together is that either they could read or somebody would teach them how to read. Now, we kind of can't even imagine what a significant shift that might have been because we presume that literacy is part of our culture. In fact, we're kind of horrified if we find out that the children in our midst can't read well, or adults get to adulthood and not being able to read well. But here we are in the 16th century, and this woman, Angela Merici, she was a bit older, probably about 60 years old, had never married, had never joined a monastery, had never become a Franciscan sister, had never become a Dominican sister, and yet she wanted to commit herself to God, imitate the life of Jesus, encourage other people to be about prayer, encourage other people to be about service, and to do that in her own hometown. She was from northern Italy, and she wanted to do it there. As I said, she really wanted to help people, and especially young women. That time of northern Italy would have been a time of a lot of wars among city-states. And just like we see today, whenever we see war, often the victims of war are not only the combatants, but the innocents. Women, children, people that are not involved in the war itself, but are the victims of war. And very often, sexual abuse is part of the weapons of war. These young women would sometimes now be, they had been raped by soldiers, they had been victims of some type of sexual abuse, and then their families didn't know what to do with them, because nobody would marry them. They probably wouldn't be accepted at that point in a respectable convent or monastery. And so what do? Angela Merici said, we gotta help these people. Let's teach them other skills. Let's give them some skills in order for them to be of service, imitating the life of Jesus, helping out their families, helping out the poor, helping out the needy, right here in our own time. You might say to yourself, I know Ursulines as educators. Actually, Ursulines in the beginning didn't really teach in a school setting. They taught skills to help people, and especially other women, to be able to make their way in life at a time when their life looked pretty hopeless. That's a really tremendous innovation that St. Angela made at the time of the Reformation. So, the middle of the 16th century, early 16th into the middle of the 16th century. Now, what are we talking about here? You see a little bit of map of northern Italy, and you see a spot, I think I highlighted it, of Brescia. That's where St. Angela was from. In the northern Italy, kind of in the center of northern Italy. Brescia's probably not a city you're that familiar with, but that would have been her homeland. So north of Florence, way north of Rome, not too far away from Germany, not too far away from France on the eastern side. And so that would have been home to her. In a sense, she would have been familiar with some of the Reformation issues, but she was thoroughly Catholic because she grew up in Italy. What happened is that there's a movement. Now, I'm having trouble seeing the slides here. I'm going to move away. I hope it doesn't mess up the sound too much. So, can you still hear me?
Yes.
All right. I just want to be able to see my slides a little bit more. One of the people that St. Angela was really inspired by was a woman named St. Ursula. Now, if you're going to try to find St. Ursula in a history book, you're not going to have a lot of success, because today we say the story is as much myth as it is history. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Jessica mentioned when she introduced me that I teach at the seminary. One of my colleagues at the seminary faculty who teaches scripture, one of the things he says regularly is all stories are true. And some of them actually happened, right? So this is the case with St. Ursula. All stories are true, some of them actually happened. The legend of Ursula goes back to about 4th century Germany. And Ursula's father wanted to marry her off in a political liaison so that he would have allies and he and his family wouldn't be attacked. She didn't want that. She, didn't want to be married for a political reason, that would be the story of her life. And she wanted to give herself more in service. And so she had a story that was very much rooted in wanting to be of service and wanting to be with other women. So the story gets bigger and bigger as you tell it. But apparently other women joined her, and she said to her father, before I do this, let me go on a trip with my companions. Let me go on a religious pilgrimage. Let me see different ways of thinking about life. And she does that. And in the course of it, she's martyred. Now, sometimes the story says that there were 10 other women with her who were martyred. Sometimes the story says 10,000. If you're a fan of Hildegard of Bingen, one of the great medieval women who was a botanist, a scholar, a mystic, a leader, but also a composer. One of her great compositions is a composition about St. Ursula, and she does this whole thing about 10,000 virgins were married. Angela was very much taken with the story of St. Ursula, as were most people of the day. They saw Ursula as an independent woman who wanted to make her own way in life, who was a follower of Jesus, who gathered other women, and she became a leader of women. Ursula was recognized in the Reformation world, the Renaissance world, as kind of the patron of medieval universities. And that would have been true not only for places where women gathered, but for places where men gathered as well. And so Angela named this company after St. Ursula. And that's what we have. That's why Ursuline Sisters are called Ursuline Sisters, because our founder, St. Angela, said, let's name it after St. Ursula. One other little trivia thing, the initials that Ursulines use after their name is OSU. And OSU is the Order of St. Ursula, right? You live in Ohio, though? What do most people think? Ohio State University. I was in Oklahoma one time, and of course in Oklahoma they thought it was for Oklahoma State, and of course the Sooner fans weren't happy about that either. But I said, no, it has nothing to do with college football at all. It only has to do with the Order of St. Ursula. And this person knew nothing about St. Ursula, so it gave me an opportunity to tell that story. Oops. I think I went too far here. What happened with the spread of religious life? Remember I talked about St. Benedict and said every time Benedict moved to a new city, or Benedictines moved to a new city, they started a new house, a new foundation, a new monastery. Well, that was very much the same with almost every religious congregation. And so Ursuline life, while it started in northern Italy, it began to move from one place to the next. And one of the places that it moved was to France. And it's the French connection, I don't mean that in terms of the movie, but it's the French connection that really is significant for Ohio and for what is now the United States. Ursulines went to France. Now, I said that Benedict had started religious life in a very monastic setting. Francis and Dominic were more itinerant preachers. But Ignatius of Loyola and Angela Merici had these more contemplatives in action. People who took prayer and service seriously, but they wanted to be out in the world. And that's exactly how they lived their life, until they got to France. And when they got to France, the bishops in France wanted to impose on many religious communities, including the Ursulines, a sense of a strict monastic cloister. Now, on the one hand, the bishops were in charge, and so what do? On the other hand, these are resourceful women who had as their kind of guides St. Ursula and St. Angela herself. And so one of the things that they did was to say, if the bishops aren't going to let us go out and teach, if the bishops aren't going to let us go out in service, we'll bring people in. So if you've ever been familiar with convent schools, they actually started in France in the 17th century because the bishops wanted to impose monasticism on them. And when they wanted to impose monasticism, they said, okay, we can't leave, but we can invite the girls in. And we can be educators now in our school. Many Ursulines at that time began to adopt a fourth vow. The typical religious vows for religious are poverty, chastity, and obedience. Many Ursulines at this time then took on a fourth vow, the vow of education. Sometimes they said the education of girls. That way, you'd say, you have to let us do it. It's part of our vow formula. And that's exactly what happened. That's also why, if you're a Youngstowner and you've lived in Youngstown your whole life, you're familiar with Ursuline High School being a co-ed school. But Ursuline High School in Youngstown as a co-ed school is an anomaly. Most Ursuline institutions are all girls. Beaumont School in Cleveland, all girls. Ursuline College in Cleveland, it started as a women's college. Most Ursuline institutions around the world are all girls. Ours is a little different. I'll talk about that in a moment. But it goes back to this French monasticism that was imposed by the French bishops in the 17th century. The other thing that happens in the 17th century is that Ursulines then come to the New World. And really early on, in 1639, Ursulines from France come to Quebec. Now, the person who is credited for that movement is Marie of the Incarnation. If you've ever been to Quebec, especially Quebec City, the old convent is still there. There are lots of things named in honor of the Ursulines, but that's when they came. You know, but they came so early on that when the Ursulines got to Quebec, there were only about 350 French settlers in Quebec at the time. It's not like they were coming into a big metropolis. Now, certainly there were lots of people because the native people were there already, but the colonists were relatively few in number. But religion always came with people who traveled from Europe to the New World. And just as a little side note, if you're a Louise Penny fan, and you know, you've read about the Three Pines novels, the one I'm reading now, I'm only on number 6, but the one I'm reading now is all about Quebec and the founding of Quebec. Maria the Incarnation is in there, the Avenue of the Ursulines is in there. Just really interesting to see this history kind of come to life. So these Ursulines were the first religious to come to the New World in 1639. And eventually they came also to the United States, at least what is now the United States. Again, it was French Ursulines who came from France first to New Orleans. 1727 they came to New Orleans. So if you've ever traveled to New Orleans, there's a great respect for the Ursulines there, you know, not from necessarily their initial foundation, although they've been there since 1727. But because they were very much part of the saving of the city and Andrew Jackson and all of that. So if you do the hop-on, hop-off tour of the city of New Orleans, you're going to hear all about the Ursulines because they're so important there. Now, I know, I say here that the Ursulines were the first women religious in what is now the United States of America. And I say that because there's a Carmelite monastery in Baltimore that claims to be the oldest settlement of religious women in the United States. They make that claim, you know, and I'm not saying they're liars here, but they make that claim because they're part of the original 13 colonies. And they came to the United States in the late 18th century. Ursulines were actually here before they were. So we can both claim first. We claim what is now the United States. They claim what were the original 13 colonies. Originally then, Ursulines came from France to Ohio. So they were already in Quebec, they were already in New Orleans. They start moving up and down the Mississippi River. But they come to Ohio in 1845. The bishop who was the first bishop in Ohio for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati brings Ursulines over, and they settle in Brown County, which is right outside of Cincinnati. So that's the oldest settlement of women religious in the state of Ohio. And 5 years later, they come from Boulogne-sur-Mer to Cleveland. Again, I have just a little mark there on the far western side of the map there, right before you get to the English Channel. You see Boulogne-sur-Mer where that capital letter A is. From there, Ursulines came from the convent there into Cleveland, Ohio. And so they came to Cleveland in 1850. The first bishop of Cleveland was Bishop Amadeus Rapp. Interestingly enough, you know, I've worked for the Diocese of Cleveland now for the last quarter century or so, and you know, they have a lot of reverence for Bishop Rapp. But the Cleveland Ursulines actually know more about Bishop Rapp than most of the other people in the diocese. And they too had most of his things, because he was a very close friend of theirs, because he brought them over. You know, all of the things that he had with him at the end of his life, he left to the Cleveland Ursulines. They've just now begun to give them to the diocese to kind of hold in perpetuity. From Cleveland, they eventually then came to Youngstown. They came to Youngstown in 1874. That's why we're now celebrating this beginning of our 150th anniversary here. At the time, Youngstown was still part of the Diocese of Cleveland, and the pastor of St. Columba at that time, now St. Columba is the oldest parish in the city of Youngstown, the pastor of St. Columba wanted sisters to teach in the parish school. And so he invited the Cleveland Ursulines to send some sisters here to teach in St. Columba's School. He had a blood sister who was in the Cleveland Ursulines. So he was pretty sure he was going to get a yes from the superior, right? Since his own sister was part of that community. And so his sister, Sister Angela Brown, as well as 5 other Ursulines, came to St. Columba, came to the corner of Rain Avenue and Elm Street to kind of set up shop. They came on September 18th, 1874. 4 days later, they were teaching in the school. You know, the women in the parish had kind of set up a house for them, and that was where they lived for a while, in that house, until they built another one. This picture that's here is the inside of the old St. Columba Cathedral. That cathedral, or wasn't the cathedral at the time, but that church burned to the ground in a fire, was struck by lightning in the early 50s. So it burned to the ground. So you don't see that anymore, but this is a picture of what the inside of the cathedral looked like. So let me talk a little bit about Ursulines in Youngstown as we get close to this, you know, kind of more contemporary era. I'm going to talk about it in 4 phases. I'm going to talk about the growth and expansion that happens from our founding here in 1874. I want to talk about the beginnings of change. And those beginnings of change really happened in the 1950s. I know a lot of people will say it was Vatican II. And whether you like Vatican II or you hate Vatican II, most people will say all the changes in the church happened then. Not really. It really started before then. But we'll talk about those changes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, what do I say here? The development of our new ministries, and then some future directions. So here's how we're going to kind of take this on. When we came to start teaching at St. Columba's School. And very quickly, there were other parishes being designed in the city of Youngstown, and also outside in other places in the diocese. Well, we were still part of the Diocese of Cleveland at that point. But very quickly, as the Catholic population expanded, what our ministries did as well. So this is a picture of Immaculate Conception School. If you're an East Sider, you recognize Immaculate, it's still there. Maybe some of you went to Immaculate. But that was like the second school that the sisters were invited to teach in and began to staff. Youngstown became its own diocese in 1943. Middle of World War II. I don't know who thought that was a good idea exactly, but there it is. We became our own diocese. And at that time, the Sisters of St. Joseph, who had been at St. Patrick's School, decided that they would go back to Cleveland so that they would all be in the Cleveland Diocese. At that point, the pastor of St. Patrick's asked the Ursulines to take over, and so they did. So we started at St. Patrick's in 1944. But then we also began to work a little bit in Columbiana County, especially at St. Patrick's in Latonia, and at St. Joan of Arc in Canton. Those were other schools that we began to teach in. This is a picture of the Rain Avenue Convent. I said when the sisters first came here, the women in the parish put together a house for them, but eventually the sisters raised enough money to build their own house at the corner of Rain Avenue and Elm Street. And that convent, built in 1896, was there until the 1960s. This is an old picture of the house at Ursuline High School. It's a harder one to see, but this had been on Wick Avenue, had belonged to one of the wealthy families here in Youngstown, and eventually the nuns took it over when they built Ursuline High School up on Bryson Street. It's interesting, the address of this house was 750 Wick Avenue. The address of the school was 745 Bryson Street. It wasn't until they tore down this old convent and they built the new Ursuline that they just traded addresses, so that now the address of Ursuline High School is 750 Wick Avenue and the address of the convent is 745 Bryson Street. And the only reason I know that, I was living at the convent at the
one of the days when you could register to vote on election day. It's a number of years ago. But a number of our sisters at that time still had 750 Wick Avenue as their voting address. It's because when they moved into the house, that's the house they lived in, 750 Wick Avenue. And then that house was torn down, the new house was built, and it was the first time they actually changed their address. All they moved was like 100 feet, but their address had changed, and this is when they changed their address. This is a picture of what people still call Ursuline, the old building on Bryson Street. That building was built in the 30s. The sisters actually started Ursuline High School as a high school academy in 1905. It was for all girls. That's how all kind of Ursuline schools started. But no men's community ever moved into Youngstown to start a boys' high school. So the Bishop of Cleveland asked the nuns at the time, would you take on boys as students? And so the sisters did. That did not seem odd to me as a kid growing up. My father went to Ursuline, Bishop Malone went to Ursuline. It was just like, yeah, boys go to Ursuline. But it was as an adult when people say, what do you mean you had boys? I was like, what? It was just kind of common. What we did then. It became co-ed in 1931. When we talk about the establishment of the diocese, Youngstown became its own diocese in 1944. What you see there is a picture of the old St. Columba's School and the old cathedral. So the building on the left-hand side is the St. Columba's School, and you see a picture of the cathedral there before it burned to the ground. I want to talk a little bit about beginnings of change. This is actually a picture of a group of our sisters on their graduation day from Youngstown State University, and it was the very first and only time that they were on campus, right? Now, how do you know it's a graduation picture? You can see in the back some other graduates. These sisters did not wear caps and gowns. They wore their habits. But all of their education actually happened at the convent. Professors from YSU would come to them and teach them at home, but they would go for graduation. And it was in the 1950s that you had things beginning to change. And one of the things was the beginnings of the Religious Formation Conference, which then said nuns ought to be educated for what they do. Vatican II, when we get to the 1960s, kind of gave some directions to religious life and say, what should you do to update religious life? Well, you should recover the story of your founder, you should update your habit, and you should kind of say, how do we read the signs of the times relative to ministry? So that's what we began to do. How do we renew our lives? One of the things we did was build a mother house in Canfield. That's a construction picture of what is still our chapel. So you can see some of that construction going on. One of the things we did was to rediscover the charism of St. Angela Merici. And so the story that I told you about Angela and Ursula, a lot of that information was only recovered beginning in the 1970s and into the 1980s. About the habit, it's the same picture that you just saw, but I want to just show you how the habit changed in a few years, really. This is the old habit. That big white thing that they wear was called a guimpe. That's a French word, right? And to tell you the truth, the reason we switched out of that is because it became way too hard to launder. It took way too much bleach. The material was just too hard to do, and I couldn't do it anymore, literally, These were not things you could take care of very easily. So the first change was to this habit. Still long, hair still covered, but notice there's no great big gimp anymore. So this is a lot easier to use. And this would have been late 50s, early 60s when they made that change. The second adaptation is an adaptation to wearing black and white and a headdress that shows part of your hair. Maybe you recognize these sisters. On the left there is Sister Teresa Winson, and the two on the right are Sister Mary Dunn and Sister Jerome Corcoran. All three of them very instrumental in educational efforts in the city of Youngstown. The adaptation we're in now is contemporary dress. This is Sister Regina Rogers, now pastoral associate at St. Edward Parish. For many years served as the assistant principal at Ursuline High School. We dress like the women of the day dress. And that's how Angela started. That's how most religious life started. People dressed in the dress of the day, but then in convents, it kind of got stuck there for hundreds of years sometimes. But that's part of the change of Vatican II. Among signs of the times are kind of renew your ministries. We started a preschool in 1963. When we started it, as far as we know, there was only one other preschool in Mahoning County. One. When we started it. It was innovative. We started Beatitude House in 1991, 1992. How do we help women who are homeless, women who are kind of out and about and down on their luck with dependent children? Well, lots of shelters, most of those for men. Now what do you do with women and children? That's how Beatitude House started, very much imitating the work that St. Angela had done. We began an HIV/AIDS ministry in 1993. Talk about people who were the new lepers, you know, trying to imitate the life of Jesus. Everybody was afraid of this new HIV virus, of AIDS. Who do you go to for help, for advice? We started an AIDS ministry in '93. We still continue to run a variety of spiritual programs. We have a labyrinth at the Mother House. And what's the current state of affairs? You know, we still are faithful to religious life. We still follow Jesus. We still follow the example of St. Angela. But like Angela, we do it with a variety of people. We try to gather more people. Religious life itself has had a variety of ebbs and flows. So we don't have the numbers that we had in the 50s and 60s, but we still have members, and we have other people who share with us in that ministry. Part of the nature of Christian life is to share the gift that we've been given, and that's what we're doing. So we do it with our associates, women and men who join with us in prayer, spirituality, and in some type of gospel service. Sometimes the gospel service is with us in the ministries we do. Sometimes the gospel service is in their own parishes or in other institutions, you know, whatever that might be. The St. Vincent de Paul Society, Dorothy Day House, whatever it is. We do a young adult outreach that we're particularly trying to kind of nurture the faith life and the service of young adult women. We have started what we call Ursuline Sisters Mission. It's restructuring some of our ministries under this title of Ursuline Sisters Mission. And we've identified these core values that we want to make available to people. Compassion, respect, hope, and hospitality. All of our ministries. Everything that we do for housing, for the poor and people with HIV/AIDS, everything we do with children, everything we do with immigrants, everything that we do with our spiritual programs, it's always trying to highlight those core values. And we have some legacy ministries. Things that we were involved in that maybe we did own at one time, or part of running, but we maybe don't own it anymore. Like local parishes, we never owned those, they're diocesan institutes, but we've been so involved in parishes. And somebody like Sister Mary Alice is now a diocesan pastoral associate at St. Luke Parish. We also have, what do I have here? Our associates working at Dorothy Day House. We continue to be very much part of it, have a seat on the board, and very much part of the work of Dorothy Day House, as well as things like Ursuline High School. You know, none of our sisters teach there anymore. We haven't owned it since the 1950s. But Ursuline still, in all that they do, talks about the fact that it was founded in 1905 by the Ursuline Sisters. And they're still very much part of handing on that charism.